Grand. There we are. Right, so we're recording. So, hello everyone. Welcome to, the first R2Kast, the first podcast by myself, Rural to Kitchen, where we've sort of turned people in farming, which was interviews written by me, probably very poorly, probably very boringly, to try and make it a bit more fun and let you guys be able to listen and actually meet people, especially this year when that's not really been an option. So the first one we've got today is we've got Glen Burrows. Not the first one today, the first one, which is today. We have Glen Burrows. Glen is with the Ethical Butcher, who you might have seen popping up on social media. So yeah, we'll just jump into it. I'm trying to do this as well as I can. When I arranged to do this with Glen, he showed me all these fancy microphones and cameras and stuff, and I'm sat here with my iPad sat on top of a couple of folders. So I'm definitely behind in that capacity here, but we'll start up, just get a wee bit of history about Glen as Glen himself, and then we'll look into Ethical Butcher later on. So Glen, who are you?
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for the intro. I'm one of the founders of the Ethical Butcher. We launched the business last February, so we haven't quite been running for a year yet. And my background before that was photography, film, and advertising. So for the last kind of 20 years, I was responsible for. I was a freelance photographer and filmmaker working in the commercial sector. So I've kind of brought that knowledge into the business, really. So I take care of the look and the feel and the messaging, the film and the photography and the brand, because we very much see ourselves as a content channel that sells a product.
Interesting. So the content sort of your primary, not product, but your primary choice, and then you're selling that product as a secondary. Is that what you mean, or?
Kind of. Our primary way of interacting with the world. I mean, we're an online brand. We don't have a shop front, so everything we do is digital. So we kind of view ourselves as we're a content channel, and that's what drives the sales, is information that we put out into the world, and that's a combination of written, filmed, and photography. And also, just because of part of the nature of how we operate as a brand, we offer this super level of traceability all the way through the supply chain. So it's really important that I go and see every farm with a camera, interview the farmer, make a film, and show people exactly where their food is coming from, so that when they're on our website, they can make informed choices.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think that traceability concept is something that has been done for a while, but it's not been sort of consumer knowledge for ages, and I think traceability is extremely important. But we'll get on to sort of Ethical Butcher in a bit more in depth later on the podcast. The reason I originally reached out to the Ethical Butcher and then that was sort of put onto Glen, luckily for him or unluckily for him, was you might have seen the idea of Regenuary on Facebook or Instagram or whatever social media you use. And that's been a concept that's been conceptualised by the Ethical Butcher last year. And they brought it up this year. The reason it's came about is the sort of influx of Veganuary. Now, if I'm probably saying that wrong, but it's basically the idea of people going vegan for January. We've bulked up on a lot of meat and turkey and whatnot over Christmas time, and folk are considering cutting any meat animal products out for the month of January. Those you don't know exactly what veganism is, it's not vegetarianism. So it's not just not eating meat, it's also not eating any secondary products, so eggs. It's not using the likes of honey. It's not using things like resin and stuff like that. There's obviously a lot more, but that's just so you know what we're talking about. My opinion on this has always been that I've never really been against going vegan. I mean, me personally, I haven't, but as a concept, I've never seen a problem with it. From health perspective, I'm no doctor. I'm in no position to say, I don't know, so if you've got a reason to go vegan for a health perspective, I think that's excellent, good. Hopefully it works, From an animal welfare perspective, I totally understand why you wouldn't be happy hearing about animals being slaughtered for our consumption or anything like that. I get that. The only thing I sort of start to change people's minds on and try and say, well, I kind of disagree, is when you're doing it from an environmental perspective. So I could see, if you're living in a place that's got a lot of grain production, US, anywhere that's got good grain production, being vegan is definitely an environmental viable option. But in Scotland here, it's not something we have. I know Glen's not in Scotland, but where we are in Scotland is and the UK for a large part as well. We can't grow grain everywhere. What we can grow is very sustainable red meat in the form of beef, lamb, and also white meats as well. What Regenuary is basically looking at that possibility. Now, I'm not going to butcher it, and pardon the pun, I'm not going to butcher it and ruin what Regenuary is, so I'm just going to pass you on to Glen. What is Regenuary? Where did it come from? And what are you doing with it?
Okay, so the idea kind of started from, it was early January last year, and I was in the centre of London, and I kept seeing posters everywhere from a lot of major fast food brands. I think it was everything from KFC to Pizza Hut to Domino's, Veganuary ready products. So it just started getting me thinking, well, first of all, you pointed this out absolutely brilliantly in one of your Facebook posts, is like January is possibly the worst month of the year to persuade somebody who's new to veganism to take it up, because there's such limited options available. I mean, you suggested Vegenuary, which would be so much better. There's so much more local produce available to you. And so I started thinking, if somebody who's eating a fairly crappy diet at the moment and they're eating a lot of these sort of fast food products, if all they do for a month is exchange the real meat for the fake meat, you're actually doing no good. And in some cases, you could be doing more harm, not just to yourself, but to the environment, because a lot of these highly processed fake meat products have been, grown in a monocrop system, which is inherently damaging to the environment. So I came home and I was had lots of thoughts and feelings going through my head about why it was wrong and how it could be better. And I just sat in front of my computer, poured myself a glass of wine and started writing a Facebook post, thinking about regenerative agriculture. We hadn't yet launched the business at that stage, so we're still trying to get that together. So I had it in my mind a lot about how to talk about regenerative agriculture and what it is. And I spent the summer visiting a lot of farms. So I was pretty kind of up to speed in my thought process about seeing the difference. I'd seen arable converted to pasture and seeing the huge increase in life that comes from that. So I wrote this Facebook post with the word Veganuary crossed out and suggested Regenuary. So, and thinking, regardless of whether you're vegan or omnivore, what happens if you try and persuade an omnivore to give up meat for a month rather than thinking about how they're sourcing all of their foods? Because potentially somebody could participate in Veganuary by eating KFC, corn burgers, and as long as there's no animal products in it, you're participating. So that was where the idea came from. And it was just one of those things. I put it up online without really thinking too much about it. I thought it might be, it might cause a bit of a stir, but by the end of the month, it had over 1 million impressions, 5,000 shares, and something crazy like 17,000. They got split over two things, but something like 17,000 comments. And the comments were everything ranging from huge outpourings of support to literal death threats.
Jeez, that's quite scary, isn't it? I mean, when someone's out there trying to make a difference, like you have there, that yes, it was just a concept and an idea and an intoxicated Facebook post, but at the end of the day, your intentions were to try and in some ways change the planet, do better for the environment, and that leads to death threats. And this is sort of part of, there's an activist side of veganism and there's also an activist side of the farmer dispute. There's two bad sides, definitely. And that's the part I wish we could mitigate. I think both people have intentions for the planet and animal welfare, but I say both people, both sides. And I wish there was sort of a come to together and a work together that could happen there. And I think that's what you guys are doing. You've got an experience in marketing and you're a bit better at coming up with good words and whatnot. I'd be like, try to do something. Nothing would actually come of it. So I think it's a great idea, and I've seen a lot of people that aren't really involved in this food production discussion talking about it and posting about it, which is excellent. And I think
that's sort of the point. Is really, I mean, after that first post, and even now when we've resurrected it this year, all we're doing, I mean, it doesn't really exist as other than the thought process. You know, I'm starting now to kind of build out a directory of how people can source all of their foods from regenerative sources. I'm linking up with grain producers and and vegetable producers, and I will be sort of building it out into something useful. But at the moment, what Regenuary is a discussion point. It's a way of having conversations about things. But people, the thing that's also struck me, particularly more so this year than last year, is the messages I'm getting from people who support what we're doing and what we're saying, but they're too afraid to say so publicly.
Right. Okay.
Which is quite astonishing to me. You know, people, I get a lot of messages from people, private messages on social media saying, thank you so much for what you're doing. I'm with you 100%, but you're really, really brave to say it. And I'm like, this is madness. If somebody who consider themselves to be an ethical omnivore can't have a discussion around the subject with somebody who's decided to be a vegan, what kind of craziness are we in?
And it's strange, isn't it? I mean, if you backed a political party, for example, yes, you might not tell everyone, but you're probably going to vote for them. And that support there in something like this, there is no voting. There's no sort of tangible evidence of support. So it needs to be that sort of backing and people backing. And if that's not there, if that's just purely in your inbox, then nothing's actually happening. So folk really do need to, I don't want to say you need to come out and stand up for what you believe in, but I think if you want to make a change and be part of that benefit, you do need to sort of have your voice listened to. But I get it's tricky. I do get it's tricky. I mean, I'm always posting my opinion on Facebook, and it's met with a lot of stuff as well on much smaller scale than yourselves. But I think more people, as they see it, like you, myself, whoever, people are like, you know what, let's have our say. Let's have our backed up say. And I think it's great. So I strongly commend you guys for what you've done.
Thank you.
And that's sort of me doing what those people in your inbox are doing. You're doing great. Keep going.
But keep me out of it.
Yeah, exactly. I'll just, but no, I think it's excellent. So good on you guys. I guess moving on from Regenuary, if you've more you want to say on that, absolutely. I was quite interested in the Ethical Butcher as a brand, as a business as well. So you've sort of touched upon what you offer in that, but what actually do you offer? What do you guys sell?
So probably to tell you the story of the brand, I probably need to backtrack a bit, if that's okay, and tell you kind of how I approached it and where I came from. So I although I've explained what my career was and sort of still is prior to founding the Ethical Butcher, I did a degree in food science and nutrition, but it was sort of aimed at the food industry. And in my degree, I was learning how to make like hyper palatable foods. We were learning how to make Twiglets and Pringles and things like that, and what you could or couldn't put on them, and what you should or shouldn't put on them to make people overeat. And so it's all about balancing ridiculous amounts of fat, sugar, salt against each other, which I kind of thought, well, I'm really interested in food. This isn't really what I want to be doing. But the turning point really was when I learned about the BSE crisis in my degree, and this was caused by basically turning abattoir waste back into animal feed. And this was animal bones in the abattoir when every last bit of usable meat has been stripped off, and they were put through a series of rotating crushing wire brushes, which would get any remaining bits off. And it was a process called mechanically reclaimed protein. But it wasn't just getting meat and tendon and sinew, it was also getting spinal fluid and all kinds of stuff. And this was being processed back into animal feed, which was just an absolutely abhorrent process. And of course, diseases were being passed on, and the disease was passed on with scrapie from sheep into mad cow disease. And anyone old enough to have been around in like 1989, 1990 would remember the BSE crisis. And for me, that was kind of enough. Things like the Ethical Butcher didn't exist. You either were a farmer and killed your own, or this was meat. There wasn't really much of an in-between. So I decided that really I didn't want to be a part of this world, and became a vegetarian and followed a different career path. And stayed that way for 25 years. So fast forward until my early mid 40s, I'd been a vegetarian for 25 years. And what made me reconsider that was just sort of checking in with myself and asking myself, how do I feel? Do I think I feel as I should do for my age? Are these things that are happening to me now, are they just because I'm getting older? And is this correct? And should I feel like this? So I started digging a bit, and I spoke to a friend who had been through the same sort of thing, but she'd started eating a paleo diet after being a vegetarian for a very long time, and saw a huge improvement to her health. Put me onto a couple of books.
Just quickly there, sorry, Glenn, could you just tell everyone what paleo diet is?
A paleo diet it's a diet which includes meat, but it tries to avoid modern products of agriculture, such as grains and seed oils, as much as possible. So you're eating meats and vegetables and dairy as the main source of calories. Very little processed food, very little refined sugar. It's looking back at thinking of, in the Paleolithic era, as much as possible, how can we match the diet that our cave-dwelling ancestors would have had? There's a lot of controversy surrounding how close we could ever get to eating like a caveman, and I completely agree with that. But essentially, what you're doing is you're eating high-quality, well-reared meats and lots of green leafy vegetables, and not so much grains, pulses, and things like that. And for me, I decided to read some books. The first book I read was Rob Wolf's Paleo Diet Solution, I think it was called. And Rob Wolf has just co-directed the film Sacred Cow. Okay. And so but a very strong part of the paleo message is that your meat should be, what did your food eat? So it's looking at the provenance of the meat that we eat, particularly the grazing herbivores, particularly the beef and lamb. And there's a huge emphasis put on grass-fed, because the same grains that aren't good for us in large amounts, also not so good for grazing ruminants. And they change the omega balance of the fats and all kinds of things. So this was, I read these books and thought, well, look, I was starting to develop some odd health problems. I developed a huge patch of psoriasis, which came from nowhere. I suffered from terrible brain fog. My energy was very low. I needed to eat all the time, like every 2 or 3 hours, I needed to eat something. And it was just, my blood sugar was just, like a roller coaster. So I was convinced enough from what I was reading to give it a try. And I did. I gave it a try, and it was like a light was switched on in my brain, like everything felt better. And over the course of the next few years, my autoimmune problems went away, my brain fog went away. I was able to fast. I lost body fat, I put on muscle, and I started just to perform better in pretty much every way I can think of. And for me, it was the difference between a high carb, high grain, higher sugar diet to one that was higher fat and higher protein, just really, really suited my constitution. So at the time as well, when I sort of made the transition, as a photographer and filmmaker, I was mostly working within sport, health and fitness. That was my kind of genre, my realm. And I was even the picture editor of Men's Fitness for 3 years, and I worked for a lot of sport and fitness magazines. So all of the people I was interacting with on a day-to-day basis were, pro athletes, trainers, bodybuilders, fitness models. And so this was just, I was surrounded by these wonderful people, all who had, fantastic knowledge and really good thinking about the subject. I went out to film at the Arnold Sports Festival, which is like the biggest bodybuilding festival in the world. And we got to interview powerlifters and bodybuilders and talk about their philosophies and diet and exercise and all, just meeting fascinating people. And it just sort of was fueling my knowledge and my resolve to keep trying different things. So anyway, that's kind of where I was at. And then I met Farshad. So Farshad is the other half of the Ethical Butcher. He was, and I was introduced to him simply because he needed a filmmaking for crowdfunding. And I met this guy through a mutual friend who said, something to do with meat, film, crowdfunding, you guys need to talk. Farshad he's Iranian. He's been living in London for like 20 years. He studied law and ended up working in Smithfield Market through a family business.
Okay.
And then he built up quite a sizable business on his own as a meat trader. So he was buying meat from the market, transporting it to someone to butcher, and then serving it to restaurants. So he was at home with a laptop and had a man in a van running around London, and that was his business. The problem with that business is that you're basically up all night and chasing money all day. So he was doing well. His business was, turning over a good money, but it was relatively low margin because of the amount of work he had to do. So he had an idea to crowdfund to create a unit where he could keep stock, do butchery, and get the van going from one place out. And then thought, well, if I've got this unit in this space, I'll make a website and sell to the public. And when I met him, that's kind of about where we were at. But he had a few ideas about the direction he wanted to go, but it was about there. And then he actually told me, he said, I as a filmmaker, I was trying to find a story. I was like, so what do we, what's the USP? What are we going to pull out here? What are we going to tell people about your business? And he said, I've come across this organization called the PFLA, the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association. Yeah. And it's only grass-fed. And I think their stuff's really high quality. And that was like, for me, I suddenly saw then, here's an opportunity to not just, to not just make a film for this guy, but to actually get involved in the business, because this is something I can stand behind. I can help turn this business into the place I would want to buy my own food. So we talked more and more and more and more. And I sort of floated the idea of having the business basically follow the ethics. So having the business be primarily concerned with ethics and let everything else kind of follow down from there. So to be the first online butcher where ethics are at the absolute priority, rather than saying we're quality or we're whatever, but let's start at the absolute top. We had a bit of a chat about it. As I said, I was pretty well researched on the subject at the time. And he turned around to me and said, I'll go down the ethics route, but on one condition. I'm like, okay, what's the condition? He goes, I'll give you part of the business and you come with me on the journey. So that's how it started. So he saw me as somebody who doesn't mind talking, and he's, doesn't mind talking about the subject and was passionate about it. And as I said, at the time, I was really struggling to know where I bought my own food from. I was going to farmers markets. I was talking to the farmers. I found that even some of the farmers at the farmers market were a bit cagey when I asked them, is it grain finished? Was there any soy in the feed? And they kind of didn't really want to fully answer questions. Sometimes they didn't even know. And, so there's all this kind of thing going on. There was the odd website here and there where I could buy direct from farmers and farms, but the quality was a bit all over the place. And half the time, I bought stuff, all the labels had come off and the packaging, and when it arrived all wet and soggy, and I didn't know what things were. So I really did see it as my intention with the Ethical Butcher was to make the business that I would want to buy from.
Yeah. And surely, it's surely being, actively interested in what you're providing is a very important thing in any business. Never mind something that you're dealing with sentient beings and so on. Yeah. Good stuff. I just wanted to quickly ask, what Arnold Classic were you at? I love it. I watch it a lot. Totally off topic.
Sorry, say that again?
What year at Arnold Classic were you at?
What year was that? That'd probably be 4 or 5 years ago, I guess.
Is that the year Eddie Hall first pulled his world record deadlift? Or was that the next year?
I don't know. We were filming a bodybuilder called Ben Pakulski.
Okay.
So we were sort of making a little film and series of stuff with him for a magazine called Iron Life. Right. So I wasn't really following the powerlifting at the time, but it was quite a fascinating world to dip into.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's probably not what you'd expect to talk about today. I certainly didn't, but no, I follow it hugely. I mean, I follow it as in I watch it on social media. I don't do any of it. But
you're not a lifter yourself?
Not in the slightest. No, I'm just a big guy. But no, I love watching.
Yeah, well, clearly I'm not. I'm a rock climber. That's my thing. I try and stay light.
I'm more the rock.
Right.
Not very hard though, just sort of a big guy. Anyway, this is going off topic.
Track.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you said you don't mind talking. I'm quite similar. I think some people maybe get annoyed with it, but you're obviously a good face for a company, that sort of thing, that can be passionate and tell people what it is you have. So if I was to go online onto Ethical Butcher, what could I buy? What specific products could I buy?
Beef, lamb, pork, and chicken. So when we launched the business, launched about 3 weeks before lockdown, and at the very beginning, all we'd forecast was beef and lamb, and the reason for that is our vetting process. So the PFLA, for those that don't know, it's probably worth me just explaining what the PFLA are and why they exist. So there's an organization called the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, and they certify farms who are dealing with grazing ruminants, so beef and lamb. And the reason they exist is that there's a loophole in DEFRA's food labeling system, which allows grass-fed to be used as a term for meat that's been predominantly fed on grass, not completely fed on grass.
Yeah.
So cattle can be grain finished and taken to an extreme form. It could be 51%, 49%, but cattle can be grain finished and still legally sold as grass-fed, as long as they spent more of their life on grass than grain. Now, what's bad about this is that even the PFLA have done research to suggest that even a couple of weeks of grain feeding is enough to completely change the omega balance of fats in the meat.
Okay.
So grain finished cattle will have high levels of omega-6, and properly pasture raised cattle will have high levels of omega-3. And one of our farmers actually, one of the farms I visited that we've yet to buy from, the farmer was a sports nutritional therapist before she took over the family farm and started farming. And she was very active in every time she sends an animal to slaughter, she takes a steak and sends it to the lab for testing. She wants to know what the nutritional content of the meat is, and then tweaks the cover crops and the pasture mixes that she feeds them the year to try and improve the carotenoids and the omegas. And she told me that she'd had one batch recently, when I filmed her a year ago, and the lab had called her up and said, if we didn't know that this was meat from the nutritional profile, we'd say that you'd sent us wild salmon,
right,
to test.
That's very interesting.
And that's what beef should be, and that's the effect it should have on our bodies when we eat it. It should be low inflammation, anti-cancer. It should be protecting us against disease, not giving us disease. And the things that cause inflammation are when the omega balance of the fats in our diet are out of whack. Ideally, we should have a 1-to-1-to-1 of 3 to 6 to 9. Our diets tend to be very, very high in 6 because that's vegetable oils, that's seed oils, which is in a lot of the processed foods we eat. And so one way you can offset this is just by making sure we're all told to eat more omega-3s, and that's simply to try and get this ratio more balanced. But anyway, that's why the PFLA exists. So farmers that sign up to the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, they're audited, they're checked, and their animals eat nothing but pasture. So they're allowed silage in the winter. I think they're allowed lucerne pellets, but they're not eating any grains. So because these farms have already been pre-vetted by the PFLA, we thought, well, that's our starting point. The places we can't go and visit ourselves and check everything out. If we buy from a PFLA certified farm, we at least know that they're meeting our sort of minimum standards, if you like. Moving on from that, as we're doing our research, we became aware of the Savory Land to Market program and what regenerative agriculture can do, and holistic management and planned grazing. And as we're talking to the farmers, they're telling us what they do. Some of them started mentioning these, holistic grazing and agroforestry systems they're doing. So then we realized what the next sort of stage on, really, from just not feeding grains, is to do something regenerative, to put the animals back into a system where you're improving soil, you're building soil, you're improving soil carbon, and you're actively improving biodiversity on the land. And some of them are measuring it through a process called ecological outcome verification, which is used with the savory methods of holistic decision making to improve biodiversity. And then we visited a couple of farms that were doing this, and that was like mind blown. Like to see what used to be effectively a desert, where an arable farmer had an area of land where they'd spent decades actively trying to reduce biodiversity because they only wanted one crop to grow. And then the beef farmer comes in and does exactly the opposite. Everything they're doing is trying to bring in as much other life as possible because it benefits the system as a whole. And they're putting a grazing herbivore into this system to perform a role, and we're performing a role within the system of the apex predator. But the point of the system is complexity, and complexity makes the system less brittle. So as we've gone on, we've encouraged more and more of our farmers, whether they're PFLA or not, is to take on these regenerative practices. And so regenerative agriculture is becoming more and more known about, and that sort of segues right back into Regenuary. But you asked sort of the ethical butcher. So we started out with beef and lamb, and we started sourcing it from PFLA farms. And it took a long time before we really started selling anything else, because I couldn't really find stuff that I was happy with. I was calling poultry farms, I was calling pig farms, and the ethics were never quite right. It wasn't quite. We sold a bit of chicken through a couple of suppliers, which I thought they were as good as they could be, but I still wasn't entirely happy because both of them had a bit of soy in their feed, and I wanted to try and eliminate soy from the food chain. So I started having a lot of conversations with feed mills, the feed mills that were supplying our chicken suppliers, and they were quite open about their ingredients and their sourcing. And all of them, they said, there is some soy. There's not much because it's very expensive, but the country of origin is Brazil. And I'm like, that I want to try and get rid of. So I started a bit of a campaign, and I actually used the fantastic knowledge base that is the PFLA forum. So the PFLA has a forum for farmers where they discuss ideas. And it's one of the most incredible places for progressive ideas in farming, and ideas. And I started putting on there, look, I know you guys are all kind of cattlemen, but anybody know anything about soy-free chicken? And a few conversations started up, and can you grow chicken without soy? And interestingly, the people that were doing chicken pretty much said no. They said modern breeds of chicken, a couple of key stages in life, the amino acids in soy can't be done. They just won't grow properly without it. We haven't found a proper substitute yet. But then we spoke to a guy who is a beef farmer who is running holistic grazing pattern, and he'd seen some methods done by a guy in America called Joel Stallatin of Polyphase Farm, who was following his beef through the rotational system with chickens, and the chickens were getting a lot of nutrition from the land because they were eating the worms and the dung beetles and all the things that the cows had stirred up, and the improvement in biodiversity there was feeding chickens. But the chickens were moved every single day onto fresh pasture. So this guy, Mark Chappell, said, I'm kind of crazy enough to get some chickens and see if this works, if you guys will sort of support me financially while we do it. And we said yes. And last year we were able to, we went through a bit of a development process with him, and we produced our soy-free chicken, which ended up winning a Great Taste Award.
That's very interesting. Because I'll be honest, when you mentioned pigs and chicken there, I was like, where's this going? I'm very interested. That's very... It could almost, I'm just thinking, depending on what the chickens pick up, it could work as a natural anthelmintic in some senses. Could it, maybe? I don't know, that's probably a discussion for another day. I didn't expect as impressive an answer for the chicken, I'll be honest. So well done. That
was kind of a bit of a pet project of mine, and the bit that really gave it validation is we sent one to a 3 Michelin star chef called Pierre Kaufman, and we sent him one, and he said it's the best chicken he's ever had, and he said it rivals anything he's had from France, to hear that from a Michelin star chef on a roast chicken is quite an honor. And yeah, our next mission really is we're doing the same with pork. We're working with our pork producers to eliminate the last little bits of soy from the feed there. And one thing that's been incredibly helpful in all this actually is meeting a guy called Duncan Farrington, and he runs a company called Mellow Yellow Rapeseed Oil. And even though vegetable oils have got nothing to do with a butchery business, I became aware of the incredible regenerative work that he was doing, and it sort of flipped on its head my thoughts on how monocropping can actually be. I just thought monocrop foods are inherently damaging, and the best you can do maybe is to plant a strip around the field or plant some trees or something, but really it's not doing much good for the world. And then I saw what he was doing of planting companion crops with his oilseed rape, doing drilling, not tilling, and his company had been certified carbon neutral. So I was really, really fascinated what he's doing. So I went to see him, and he showed me what he does. And whole company had achieved carbon neutral status because they're putting so much carbon back into the soil with all these methods they're using. He was also putting. He was also using vetch and using vetch and legumes to fix nitrogen and phosphorus back into different plants. He'd planted strips around the edge, which had particular mix of wildflowers that the things that would heat his rate would prefer, other things which would encourage pollinators that would eat the bugs that would be on his rate. So just this incredible system. And as I was talking to him and interviewed him, he said, "Oh yeah, and after we've pressed the oil out of the oilseed rape, we end up with this stuff called rapeseed meal. And even before we get to use that, we're carbon neutral. And the rapeseed meal is very high in protein and high in omega-3. So, and I said, well, what do you do with it? He said, oh, it gets used for chicken and pig feed. And I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. We need to use it. So now we're sort of working with our pork supplier to try and replace the soy with this stuff, which is a carbon neutral product. So yeah, if that works, I'm going to be very happy about that, because it's kind of completing the circle from a carbon point of view.
That's cool. I'm going to follow that page. That sounds very interesting. It's funny, the whole idea of, eliminating herbicides and stuff is very difficult. Very difficult. It's one of the biggest things in agriculture, you know. Yeah. And one company I've always followed is a small robot company.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
like Tom, Dick, and Harry are the coolest little things in the world. But I won't get into that. Maybe we'll have
I'm huge fans of Small Robot, and they did something incredibly kind to us, actually.
Right.
They're big supporters of what we're doing, and they actually shared our upcoming crowdfunding campaign on their campaign, which is incredible. I mean, there's a lot of love there.
Well, I mean, if I can get their contact, that would be excellent. No, absolutely cool. Brilliant. Cool. Well, I mean, I think unless you've got anything more you'd like to say about the Ethical Butcher specifically, Glenn, I'm happy with what we've covered there. Unless there's anything you'd be looking.
No, I guess there's one more thing. If I can
absolutely.
get a quick
absolutely.
Is I really would like. We've grown very quickly in the last year, and we're about to go through our second crowdfunding raise. We're launching that in February. So if anyone's interested in investing, it's an EIS scheme. So you get tax back on your investment, and you actually own a part of our company for your investment. So if anyone really wants to support us, either look at the website, buy some meat. If you want to take it a stage further, we're obviously very welcome to invest in us when we're live on Crowdcube in February.
Well, quite an opportunity that, and if you want to pass me on a link to that funding, I'll put it in descriptions in Spotify, YouTube, wherever this goes.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. No, not at all. I would say thank you for you being on, but I've got a couple of things I'd just like to ask you. I wanted to try and keep that people in farming was what I called this before. It was just chatting to people in all corners of the farming industry. And two things I always ask people was, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And if you had any tips for people coming into your industry, which for you is very everywhere, give tips for everything if you wish. That's absolutely fine. That was always something I did. So where do you see yourself, and where do you see Ethical Butcher in 5 years?
In 5 years, I'd like to think that we would continue to grow and exist, but I think what I'd like to see the difference we made is in 5 years' time, I would like to see our company used as a trademark or used as a guarantee of provenance, really.
Okay.
I'm a bit frustrated at the moment that there isn't one place that people can go to look on poultry, pork, wild game, beef and lamb and say it has this particular tick, therefore it has been farmed in a regenerative way. So I'd like in 5 years' time our company to stand for almost to be a certification for regeneratively produced meat.
So
I think if we can get to a stage where
I was just going to say you're looking
where we're
to
recognised
regenerative assurance, you could be that scheme.
Kind of, yeah. But more than that, to include not just regenerative assurance, but animal welfare. The whole part of it. So looking at animal welfare, looking at I'd like to, in 5 years' time as well, I'd like to think that we've got a better grip on slaughter because it's the one part of the process we don't have control over. Our farmers are using whichever abattoirs they choose, and it ranges from small farm kill units to big abattoirs. And I'm just not happy that we don't have control over that part of the process. Okay. So I would really, really like to think in 5 years' time we had a mobile abattoir which could offer the highest levels of welfare and lack of fear to the animals. I think that would really kind of just, the animals that our farmers keep have the most fantastic levels of care. And the most important day is something that we don't have control over. And would be nice to have control over that as well. So that's the two things I'd like to achieve in 5 years.
It's a big 5 years for you then. No, good. I mean, the slaughter process is one I'm sure our butchers do everything they can to make it as welfare aware for the animals as possible. It's one that we're always going to struggle to talk to the public about, no matter how we defend it. And I get that. I totally get that. But yeah, if there's some kind of, there already is assurance schemes for sure for slaughterhouses and whatnot, but if for your business specifically you're able to have a say in that would be beneficial for you guys. Brilliant. Yeah, and well, I mean, take from this what you will. Talk about any part of your career. Maybe in marketing agriculture would be quite an interesting one because it's a place we don't have much of. We've got companies that do that, companies like QMS in Scotland, Red Tractor, NFUs, that sort of thing. But what would your tips be to folk to try and promote agriculture as a,
agriculture? So something as an outsider to agriculture. I mean, until 2 years ago, I live in central London. Until 2 years ago, I'd barely been to a farm. Even I grew up in the countryside, but I'm very much an urban dweller. And the thing that really struck me was I went to a Groundswell Festival run by John Cherry. Fantastic festival, all about regenerative agriculture and farming. And when I was there, I was really struck about there was a strange disconnect between agriculture and food. And I couldn't quite get my head around it. I was at this festival talking about regenerative agriculture, thinking this has to be where the best ingredients and the best produce in the whole country are made by the people here. And yet there's no sense of how that connects to high quality food. So I think if someone's in agriculture and they're wanting to promote what they do and promote their products, it's just reminding people that what they're making is food.
Yeah.
And that sounds like such a bizarre thing to even have to say. But in fact, you and I chatted a bit about this when we had our phone call. There's a disconnect between agriculture and food, and usually it's because there are so many steps in between. There's processing and distribution, and things get very kind of mixed up in that. But talk about provenance and talk about food and link it to agriculture. Have people make that link.
Brilliant. And that's part of what I've tried to do ever since I came out of college and push that. And I think people are now, farmers they've always been aware of that connection, obviously, And I think hopefully we're trying to promote it and promote that food you're eating is, one, and you guys are doing this specifically, good for the environment, two, that animals not went through anything, and three, hopefully good for you as a consumer. The good for you as a consumer part is, I would say, it's not our job. We're just not great at it. That's not we haven't looked into that, the human nutrition side of it. That what you guys are doing is great and promoting that. There's a different sector required for that. But I think what you're saying is just talk about the farming and food connection. And I mean, hence the name of my page. No, exactly. I think that's excellent. I think from my perspective, that was great. If you've anything else you'd like to say, fire on. Love to hear it.
I think you've asked some good stuff there, and we've kind of covered off, where we are, what we stand for, and where I think things are going. So thank you very much for having me.
No, not at all. And I appreciated you coming on. I mean, I sent the message and you replied in about 2 minutes. So I was impressed at that for sure. If you have any tips for me as well, I'm asking for tips for everyone that's listening. You seem very good. I mean, I think I said at the start of the podcast, for those of you listening, I phoned Glen just before it, just to make sure everything was all right. And he showed me, he didn't show me, he told me all this kit he had. And I'm like, oh my God, like I'm doing this off an iPad, sitting in 2 folders. So if you have any tips...
If you think my audio is working, then I'll put you onto this device I'm using to get good audio, because I'll send you a couple of links on email when we've finished for the bits and pieces. But the picture's as clear and good as it needs to be, and I can hear you perfectly clearly. But if you do want to up your game, I'll send you what I'm using.
I probably need to up my game. So yeah, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll keep in touch. And one thing I will say to everyone listening, what are you guys on? Facebook, Instagram?
Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.
So follow the Ethical Butcher on those 3 platforms. Check out their website, and also if you want to buy some meat from them, obviously do that. And the final thing was Glen had mentioned there the crowdfunding link, which will be coming live next month. I'll once that comes live, I'll put that in the descriptions and whatnot for you.
Thank you very much. Really
kind. No, not at all. Thank you. And I'll just stop the recording there.